What if I told you that behind the glittering chandeliers and golden gowns of Versailles lay a world of lice, infested wigs, chamber pots tossed from windows, and childbirths performed like public theater? The royal women of 17th century France lived not in luxury, but in filth, fear, and quiet suffering. This is the untold, disgusting truth of palace life the history books politely leave out. Imagine walking into one of the most extravagant palaces the world has ever known. Gilded corridors, sparkling chandeliers, and enough silk and satin to circle the earth twice. But breathe in too deeply, and you'd catch a stench so awful it could make a bouquet of roses wilt from across the room. Welcome to the Palace of Versailles in the 17th century, a place where beauty clashed with squalor, elegance coexisted with filth, and royal women, despite their riches and titles, lived through appalling hygiene conditions. Today, we take a closer look, thankfully only figuratively, at the shockingly unsanitary lives of noblewomen during the peak of French royal power. These are the 5 worst hygiene habits of royal women. And believe me, you're not prepared. Bathing. If you were a noblewoman in 17th century France, you were expected to embody grace, charm, and impeccable style. But when it came to hygiene, things quickly turned unpleasant. Bathing, the basic act we now link with cleanliness, was often shunned. Then science hadn't yet aligned with common sense. Physicians believed warm water opened the pores dangerously, allowing disease to enter. Add to that the Church's firm stance against bathing, calling it a breeding ground for vanity and sin, and you had a society gradually abandoning the idea of regular washing. Private baths weren't common, and daily showers were unheard of. Full body cleansing was seen as unnecessary, hazardous, or even immoral. Instead, most nobles, including royal women, would wipe down their hands, face, and sometimes neck using damp cloths. But these weren't wet with clean water. They were often soaked in alcohol, vinegar, or even spit, believed to clean the skin without overexposing it. To make matters worse, when bathing did happen, and it was rare, it was a communal affair. The whole family shared one tub. And who went first? The men. By the time a woman got her turn, the water was lukewarm, murky, and full of residue. That's if any water remained at all. As for the palace itself, the smell extended far beyond the stables. Visitors frequently remarked on the overwhelming odor that filled Versailles. A mix of stale perfume, sweat, animal fat, and mildew. The royals certainly cared about appearances, but their ideas of cleanliness were vastly different from ours. Women, expected to be models of beauty and refinement, wore luxurious gowns and ornate jewelry, and powdered their faces to perfection, but beneath the surface was skin untouched by soap for months. It was the very definition of looks good from a distance, far from good up close. Toilets, if skipping baths wasn't bad enough. The next hygiene practice, or lack thereof, is something we take completely for granted today: toilets. The Palace of Versailles was an architectural wonder, brimming with opulence and home to Europe's elite. But here's the shocking truth: it had almost no proper toilets. With hundreds of rooms and thousands of visitors, there were barely any functioning bathrooms. Instead, the court used chamber pots, small bowls placed under beds, behind drapes or inside closets. When nature called, the pot was used. Then, if not by the person themselves, someone would toss the contents out the window. And if the wind wasn't in your favor, well, let's just say you'd regret walking underneath. Or if the street below was too crowded, an unlucky passerby could receive a nasty surprise. Some courtiers didn't even bother with chamber pots. Men were often seen urinating from balconies or relieving themselves in the palace gardens. Visitors and foreign dignitaries were horrified by what they saw. This wasn't just the occasional misstep. It was a widespread issue. The palace gained a notorious reputation for its overwhelming odor, with corridors frequently serving as makeshift toilets. Imagine being a lady of the court, gracefully moving through the hallways in a grand gown, lifting your skirts not only to show off detailed embroidery, but also to avoid stepping in human waste. Conditions deteriorated so badly that by 1715, a royal order was issued mandating that the palace corridors be cleaned once a week. Not every day, not after formal events, just once a week. And that was seen as progress. Now, let's talk about wiping. Toilet paper didn't exist. People used whatever they could find: cloth rags, leaves, straw, or in desperate situations, even their hands. Washing afterward was rare if it happened at all. When the toilet was essentially a window and personal hygiene was minimal, it's no surprise that disease and parasites spread easily. Wigs, if Versailles was the center of Europe's fashion obsession, nothing exemplified it more than the towering wigs and hairstyles of noblewomen. These were not ordinary hairdos. They were engineering marvels. Hairstyles rose high above the head, decorated with ribbons, pearls, miniature gardens, and even tiny ships. Yes, actual model ships perched atop powdered curls. To achieve these enormous designs, women filled their hair with wire frames, horsehair, and padding made of wool or cotton. Once the structure was built, they applied thick pomade made of animal fat, especially beef tallow, to set it in place. But that same greasy pomade also attracted lice, since women rarely washed their hair or removed their wigs for cleaning. Lice infestations weren't just common, they were expected. Colonies of lice thrived in those elaborate updos. Women carried long-handled silver lice claws to scratch their scalps without messing up their appearance. These ornate tools were sometimes brought to dinners or social gatherings, where a woman might pause mid-conversation or between sips of wine to scratch discreetly. Despite the discomfort, skipping fashion was unthinkable. In the rigid court hierarchy, appearance meant everything. Being out of fashion risked social downfall. Even if your head was crawling with lice and your wig reeked of rancid fat. Wigs weren't just uncomfortable and unsanitary, they were also hazardous. Some were so heavy they caused neck pain. Others caught fire from nearby candles. Still, they were considered the cost of maintaining one's social standing. Poor women, by contrast, avoided the burden entirely. They simply shaved their heads to prevent lice. But for noblewomen, their hair was their crown, even if it concealed a thriving ecosystem underneath. Food? Now let's shift to something that should have brought delight: food. Royal banquets were famous for their extravagance. Tables piled high with meat pies, pastries, roasted pheasants, and sugared fruits. But behind the luxury lurked a disturbing truth. The royal kitchens weren't exempt from Versailles' sanitation issues. In fact, they often suffered the most. The palace's plumbing was so inadequate that raw sewage occasionally backed up into cooking areas. There are accounts suggesting that, at least once, wastewater reached the private kitchen of Queen Marie Antoinette. The result? A devastating impact on food safety. Without modern refrigeration or proper ventilation, or with waste management nearly non-existent, contamination was a constant issue. Meat spoiled rapidly. Fruits and vegetables were left out for days. Pests roamed unchecked, and yet the cooks had no option but to continue preparing and serving food, often hazardous, to the highest levels of nobility. The results: widespread gastrointestinal issues. Diarrhea, vomiting, and infections were frequent occurrences. But the most disturbing problem was parasites. Members of the royal court were regularly infected with intestinal worms, especially tapeworms. Thanks to undercooked meat and unhygienic kitchen environments, even Louis Ivy was not immune. He reportedly expelled a 6-inch-long tapeworm. A grim reminder that not even the most powerful man in France could escape the consequences of poor sanitation. For the women of the court, dining was a refined performance. They were expected to eat delicately, make conversation, flirt, raise toasts, and entertain, all with poise. Yet many of them were silently suffering through nausea, cramping, and more severe illnesses, doing their best to uphold appearances. Childbirth, and finally, we come to what may have been the most personal and agonizing experience in a woman's life: childbirth. For royal women, it wasn't just painful, it was a public spectacle. In 17th century France, when a queen or high-ranking noblewoman went into labor, the event was treated as a matter of national importance. Quite literally, the birthing chamber would be crowded with courtiers, doctors, clergy, and aristocrats, not there to help, but simply to watch. When Queen Marie Therese gave birth, the room was so full that it resembled a theater more than a place for medical care. Why? Because royal births had to be witnessed to prevent any possibility of scandal. People feared that if a child was stillborn or female, the baby might be swapped for a healthy male heir. To prevent deceit, the entire delivery had to occur in full view. This meant that the mother, enduring immense pain, and in that moment of emotional and physical agony, she was surrounded by an audience during one of the most vulnerable experiences of her life. There was no privacy, no dignity, only expectation. Marie Antoinette famously fainted after giving birth, overwhelmed by the stifling heat and the sheer number of people packed into her room. She wasn't alone. Many women collapsed, wept, or endured serious complications, all while being watched as if they were part of a live performance, and childbirth itself was anything but safe. With limited medical understanding and no antibiotics, it was extremely risky. 1 in 3 children died before reaching the age of 3. Mothers, too, faced high mortality rates, often due to infections caused by unwashed hands and unsterilized tools. So while royal births were moments of national pride and celebration, they were also laced with fear, physical pain, and danger. The emotional burden placed on women expected to give birth under scrutiny, pressure, and risk was enormous. Conclusion, so there you have it. 5 grotesque realities behind the golden façade of Versailles. Beneath the silk gowns, perfumed corridors, and glittering jewels, royal women endured lives filled with discomfort, indignity, and peril that would shock modern sensibilities. They were the public symbols of elegance and refinement. Yet behind the scenes they scratched, suffered, and endured in ways history rarely remembers. If you thought royal life was all about banquets and ball gowns, think again. The truth was far messier and far more human. Until next time, keep uncovering the past, because history isn't just fascinating. Sometimes it's downright filthy.